Humanity's strength wasn't in its shipyards or its troop counts. It was in its willingness to sit in the darkness and wait, to eat less, to sleep cold, to lose friends and family and still get up the next day and fight, to turn a conflict from a quick, decisive engagement into a long, slow, grinding process of attrition, to make victory so costly, so exhausting, that the opponent simply gives up from the sheer spiritual fatigue of it all. The exchange crystallized the core of human resilience. It wasn't about winning fast. It was about lasting long. The general saw war as a firefight. Baba Yaga described it as a siege. And in a siege, the side with the deeper wells, the stronger walls, and the greater hunger always holds the advantage. The philosophy applied directly to the silent standoff happening overhead. The human fleet wasn't there to win a battle today. It was there to prove a point. That humanity was prepared for a war that lasted years, decades, centuries, that they were willing to pay a price the Concordium had never even considered calculating. The concept of strategic hunger became their defining card on the table. They weren't the strongest species in the room. They were the one you could never ever starve out. Then she stopped explaining. She delivered. The Concordium expected compromise, a back and forth. A slow grinding down of demands into some mutually acceptable face-saving middle ground. That is how diplomacy worked in their experience. They anticipated counterproposals, concessions, a process. They got an endpoint. You have 24 standard hours, Baba Yaga said. Her voice was clean. No emotion, no plea. Just a statement of operational reality. Cease all hostilities against human-affiliated colonies and vessels. Withdraw your forces to the pre-conflict demarcation lines. The words hung in the air. The silence that followed was thick, disbelieving, a deadline, an ultimatum. They were not used to being given orders in their own hall. Above them, the silent fleet held its position. A net of dark metal and dormant energy stretched across their sky. It was the period at the end of her sentence, the unspoken or else that didn't need to be spoken. Its presence was the threat. A non-attack that promised an attack. A held breath that promised a scream. She didn't frame it as a demand. I am not dictating terms, she clarified, her tone almost conversational. I am describing the weather. This is the atmospheric pressure. This is the coming storm. You can choose to go inside. She reduced the vast, complex galactic conflict to a simple human-scale need. A fundamental right. We want our children to see the sunrise without fearing bombardment. It was not a negotiable point. It was not a bargaining chip. It was the core non-negotiable reason for everything. Survival, safety, the right to exist without a knife at your throat. The phrase landed with a weight all its own. It stripped away the politics, the strategy, the posturing. It was a parent's prayer, a farmer's hope, the most basic claim any living thing can make. The Concordium's arguments about territorial expansion, resource rights, and galactic precedents crumbled against it. What was their legal theory against a child's fear? You are at a crossroads, she told them, her gaze sweeping the stunned assembly. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The choice was binary, a simple fork in the road. One path led to the fleet overhead activating. The other led to it powering down and leaving. There was no third option. No hidden lane. No room for interpretation. The anticipation in the room crystallized into a cold, sharp dread. How would they process this? As an act of aggression? A declaration of war? Or as the stark, simple warning it was intended to be? Delegates looked to their aides. Military advisors whispered into comms. The silent calculus of response began, but it was no longer a leisurely discussion. The clock was ticking. An invisible timer had started the moment she finished speaking. The debate was over. The time for words had passed. The ultimatum was not an opening position. It was the final one. It forced a shift from endless deliberation to immediate, consequential action. They could talk among themselves for the next 24 hours, but the terms would not change. The fleet would not move. The choice remained. The power brutally had been shifted to them. They had one day to decide what kind of sunrise their own children would see. The diplomat posture was gone. Baba Yaga's voice lost its careful diplomatic cadence. The shift was subtle but absolute. Her shoulders relaxed. Her eyes, which had been measuring the room, now held it. She was no longer a representative making a case. She was a predator giving a lesson. The Concordium still hoped for a traditional resolution. A treaty. A negotiated pause. A return to the comfortable rhythms of galactic politics where words could be walked back and compromises could be found in the margins. They were no longer in that kind of meeting. "The mask," she said, the words clear and cold in the vast chamber, "is slipped." It wasn't a shout. It was quieter than that. A statement of fact. A shift in atmospheric pressure. Now you must decide whether you prefer the face beneath. The words hung there. A choice presented with surgical clarity, not between war and peace, but between two different kinds of war. One fought with rules, embassies, and shared coffee. And the other? The one that came after the mask came off. She explained it to them, her tone that of a mentor explaining a fundamental truth to a slow student. "We are polite because we choose to be, not because we are weak, not because we fear you. We build embassies. We share coffee. We trade goods and art and scientific data. That is the mask. It is a tool, a very useful one. It allows for commerce, for dialogue, for a galaxy where children can look at the stars and see neighbors, not targets." She held up a hand, a simple human gesture. But masks are fragile things. They are not our face. They are what we wear over it. And there is a limit to how much violence you can hide behind a facade of courtesy before the facade cracks, before the weight of the contradiction shatters the porcelain and you are left with only the truth of what is underneath. The moment landed in the chamber, with the force of a physical law. It was no longer a threat. It was a philosophy of existential caution, a warning label on the entire human species. They were being told in clear and certain terms that the civilized behavior they had witnessed was a performance, a voluntary act of restraint, a choice made every single day. It was not their inherent nature. It was their discipline. The anticipation became a sharp, cold thing in the room. What did the unmasked humanity truly look like? They had glimpses. The stories of farmers and mothers, the silent fleet overhead, the talk of strategic hunger. But those were fragments, pieces of a whole they were now being forced to imagine. A unified picture of a species that saw diplomacy not as a goal, but as a tactic, one option on a menu that contained far darker, more permanent selections. The resolution of her shift was devastating in its simplicity. Diplomacy was not humanity's natural state. It was a leash they held onto, a set of rules they imposed upon themselves. It was a show of strength, not of limitation. The civility, the politeness, the offered thermos, it was all a demonstration of control. It said, "Look what we can do. Look how carefully we can behave, and understand completely that we are choosing to do so." The power dynamic inverted entirely. They were not being negotiated with out of necessity. They were being negotiated with out of a courtesy that could be withdrawn at any moment. The choice was no longer about terms. It was about which version of humanity the Concordium wished to deal with. The one with the mask, or the one without. Then she gave them the final piece. The core truth. The Concordium sought reassurance. They wanted the predictable comfort of a stated intention, a promise of peace, a guarantee that the silent fleet overhead was just a negotiating tactic, a show of force to be walked back from. They wanted the mask to settle back into place. They received a confession instead. Baba Yaga looked out across the sea of alien faces, her own expression utterly calm. "We are predators," she said. The words were simple, clean. They carried no tone of boasting, no hint of threat. They were delivered as a statement of biological fact, the same way one might state that water is wet or that fire burns. It wasn't an apology. It was an explanation, a key turning in the lock of their understanding. She let the silence hang for a moment, letting the three words reconfigure the reality of the room. Every diplomatic gesture, every shared cup of coffee, every carefully worded treaty, they all snapped into a new, sharper focus. They were not the actions of a species learning to be civilized. They were the actions of a civilized species choosing to manage its nature. Civilization, she continued, her voice low and even, provides the rules, the structure. It is the leash that keeps this nature in check. It allows for markets, for art, for conversation. It allows us to sit in this room and speak, instead of acting on more fundamental impulses. Each revelation from the human diplomat forced a painful adjustment, a crack in a foundational belief. The story of the farmer with the shotgun wasn't just a sad tale. It was a data point on a graph they didn't know how to read. The coffee wasn't a primitive offering. It was a sophisticated test. The silent fleet wasn't a bluff. It was a statement of conditional peace. Every piece of the puzzle was a different shape than they expected, and it wouldn't fit into their old picture of the galaxy. Species that had spent millennia judging others by their pedigree now had to measure by a new metric: resilience. How much could you take? How long could you last? It was a brutal, ungenteel way to measure a culture. It had nothing to do with art or philosophy or elegant technology. It was about the raw, stubborn will to exist, a quality humanity had just demonstrated in abundance. Those who valued overt power, the gleaming dreadnoughts, the shock troops, the visible, calculable force, now had to confront the strength and restraint, the power of the unmade move, the threat of the silent ship. They had to acknowledge that a held blade was often more terrifying than a swinging one, that patience could be a weapon more devastating than any plasma caster. This was a complete inversion of their understanding of deterrence. You could see the division form in the chamber, the adapters and the resistors. Some delegates leaned in, their forms tense with the effort of this new calculus. They were the pragmatists, the ones who could feel the wind shifting and knew it was smarter to adjust the sails than to pretend the storm wasn't coming. Others remained rigid. Their postures screamed denial. They were the traditionalists, the empires built on the old rules who would rather break than bend. The tension was no longer between humanity and the Concordium. It was within the Concordium itself, a civil Cold War of ideology sparked by a single human in a room. The entire galactic order trembled. This wasn't just about a border dispute or a resource conflict. This was about the rules of existence, the definition of power itself. A single diplomatic encounter had thrown 1,000 years of precedent into a star. The established hierarchy, the comfortable certainty of who led and who followed, was now a question mark. The floor of the Grand Hall felt less stable. The ancient banners seemed to pulse with uncertainty rather than authority. Humanity's entry into galactic society was no longer an admission, it was a redefinition. They didn't ask to join the club. They walked in and changed the bylaws. What it meant to be civilized was no longer about how advanced your technology was or how long you'd avoided war. It was about your control, your self-awareness, your understanding of your own nature and your willingness to manage it for the good of others. And, conversely, your willingness to stop managing it if the situation demanded. Civilization was no longer a state of being. It was a tool, a choice, a mask. And humanity had just shown the galaxy that they were the most skilled practitioners of that art anyone had ever seen. The old masters were now the students, and the lesson was just beginning. The Grand Hall did not empty. It distanced. The immediate crisis of the 24-hour deadline remained, but it now felt secondary, a symptom. The larger implication settled like a fine dust over every delegate, every aide, every silent observer. The room continued its frantic, hushed debates, the clicks and hums of 100 species trying to find a path forward. But the conversation was different now. It happened under a shadow. The shadow of the ships. The shadow of the choice. The shadow of potential violence that had not been unleashed but had been unmistakably promised. Above them, the human fleet held its position, a silent promise of action. They did not shift. They did not power down. They did not give a single sign of impatience or unease. They were a fact, a conditional fact. Their stillness was a louder statement than any transmission. It said the clock was still ticking. The offer stood. The consequence waited. They were the physical manifestation of the new reality, a sword that had been drawn but not yet swung. The threat of its fall was now a permanent part of the galactic equation. Baba Yaga's words did not fade with her silence. They echoed. They traveled on tight beam communications to homeworlds. They were analyzed by AI and discussed in war rooms and parsed by philosophers. They moved beyond the chamber into the wider galactic consciousness. The idea of civilization as a leash, the concept of strategic hunger, the confession of being predators. These were not just negotiating points. They were philosophical grenades that had been rolled into the foundations of interstellar politics. They would be debated and feared and misunderstood for a century. A single human had redefined the terms of engagement for every species in the room. The anticipation was no longer about the next hour. It was about the next century. How would this moment reshape every interaction to come? Every trade negotiation would now happen with the memory of the silent fleet. Every border discussion would recall the stories of farmers and mothers. Every diplomatic greeting would be measured against the offered cup of coffee. The mask of politeness was still there. But everyone now knew it was a mask. They knew there was a face beneath it. And they knew the wearer controlled when it was seen. A new galactic reality emerged from the tension of that chamber. It was not a reality of peace or war. It was a state of coexistence between civility and threat. They were no longer separate things. They were two sides of the same coin, forever flipped in the air. Humanity had not won a war. They had changed the weather. The atmosphere of the galaxy now held a permanent low pressure, a constant quiet hum of possibility. The memory of this encounter would be the lens through which every future action was viewed. The unspoken agreement that began to form was not written in treaties. It was written in the silent understanding that some lines, once crossed, could not be uncrossed, and that the most dangerous force in the galaxy was not the one that destroyed worlds, but the one that chose every single day not to. The choice to be civilized had become humanity's ultimate display of power, and its withdrawal, their final warning. The ships hung in the void, a permanent question mark against the stars. The Concordium first heard it as posturing, a typical diplomatic threat. The kind of strained rhetoric a cornered species uses when it has no real cards left to play. They expected the substance to be negotiable, the language to be a starting point for haggling. They were wrong. They understand it now. It was not a threat. It was a statement of cause and effect, an explanation of function, a description of the machinery. Stop the input, the attacks, and the output remains the same. The mask stays on, the coffee is shared, the embassies remain open. Continue the input, and the output changes. The machine performs its other function. It was a simple, binary operating manual for human interaction. They weren't being negotiated with. They were being instructed. This isn't a negotiation. It is a presentation of fact, an owner's manual for a contained reaction. Humanity was showing them the controls and explaining in clear, simple terms what each lever did. The warning reframes everything they thought they knew about diplomacy. Civility is not a natural state. It is not a sign of enlightenment. It is a deliberate, dangerous mask, a tool worn by choice, a performance maintained for mutual benefit. It is the most sophisticated form of threat display because it shows what is being held back. It says, "This is the face I can show you." The other one is less pleasant. Your actions determine which one you see. The anticipation is no longer about the terms. It is about the galaxy's capacity to listen. Will they heed the warning? Will they understand that this is not a game of chicken, but a statement of physical law, that provoking a predator has a predictable and violent outcome? The question hangs over the silent chamber, more imposing than the fleet overhead. The consequences of ignorance are no longer abstract. They are spelled out in the simple, brutal logic of the warning itself. A refusal to listen is not a political stance. It is a choice to experience the alternative. The admission was staggering in its implications. It meant their entire society, with all its complexity and beauty, was not a monument to their inherent goodness. It was a containment system, a brilliant, intricate, and voluntary cage built around a core of something much older and far less gentle. But a leash, she said, and her tone did not change, is a tool, not a law of physics. It is a choice made every single day by every single one of us, to follow the rules, to be polite, to pretend the mask is our face. She paused, letting the weight of that daily conscious effort settle on the assembly. And tools can be set down. Rules can be suspended, when survival demands it. The confession recontextualized everything. The farmer with the shotgun was not a desperate man. He was a man whose leash had been cut. The mother with the blade was not a victim. She was a predator defending her cubs. The silent fleet was not a threat. It was the physical manifestation of a rule being readied for suspension. The elder species in the chamber were forced into a brutal recalibration. They had to discard their entire framework for understanding humanity. They were not dealing with a young, impulsive race. They were dealing with an ancient, self-aware force that had spent its entire history building a prison for itself and held the keys. Their most terrifying quality was not their strength or their strategy. It was their profound, unsettling self-awareness. They knew exactly what they were. They knew the cost of the civility they offered, and they knew the precise conditions under which they would stop offering it. The resolution was not a promise or a threat. It was a new, colder reality settling over the Concordium. They now understood they were not negotiating with a government. They were negotiating with a nature, and that nature had just looked them in the eye and told them exactly what it was. The power in the room had shifted completely. It was no longer about what humanity would do. It was about whether the Concordium would force them to be what they truly are. Then she stopped. The explanations were over. The warnings had been issued. The fleet was a silent fact overhead. The Concordium waited. They expected the next phase. A counteroffer. A softening of terms. A window for them to insert their own demands. The dance of diplomacy required steps. They were prepared to take one. She gave them nothing to dance with. Choose. The word was a single syllable. It fell into the grand hall and killed all other sound. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was an instruction. A binary switch presented without context, without qualification, without a single word of elaboration. War or peace, withdrawal or consequence, the mask or the face, all of it was contained in that one devastating sound. She offered no hand-holding, no guidance on how to choose. No list of benefits for compliance or horrors for defiance. The simplicity of it was its power. It stripped away their protocols, their committees, their endless debate. It reduced a galaxy-spanning conflict to a yes or no question. It was a trapdoor that opened beneath their feet, dropping them out of the theoretical and into the immediate. The room did not erupt. It fractured. A low hum of panicked communication began as delegates turned to their aides, their body language screaming where their voices dared not. There were no celebrations, no cheers for a resolution, only the sharp, fear-inflected debates of species realizing the game had changed and the rules were now terrifyingly simple. They weren't discussing policy. They were calculating survival. Each faction, each delegate was suddenly and violently alone with their own position. The Vorlan had to weigh their pride against the ships hanging over their homeworld. The hegemony had to measure their ancient treaties against this new, undeniable reality. The unaligned species had to pick a side quickly, in a conflict that was no longer a distant debate. The anticipation was no longer about what humanity would do. It was a watching game, a study in reaction. How would the militarists respond? Would they bluster and call the bluff only to find it wasn't one? How would the pragmatists move? Would they try to form a bloc to negotiate as a unit, only to find the offer was non-negotiable? The power had utterly shifted. It was no longer in human action but in Concordium decision. Humanity had done all it would do. They had stated their terms, revealed their strength and explained their nature. The ball was now in the other court. The next move was theirs, and the timer was still ticking. The silence from the human diplomat was more menacing than any speech. She just stood there watching them unravel. Her work was done. She had presented the choice. The rest was their problem. The complex machinery of galactic politics designed for slow, grinding compromise had been short-circuited by a single word. The leverage was no longer about who had the bigger fleet. It was about who was willing to live with the consequence of their choice. And humanity had just proven, quite conclusively, that they were prepared to live with either outcome. The simplicity was the threat. It left no room for them to maneuver, no room for their cleverness. Only a direct, unavoidable question that demanded a direct, unavoidable answer. The waiting began. The human ships did not move. They maintained their position. A perfect grid-like formation suspended in the void above the council world. Their engines were dark. Their weapons were silent. They did not scan. They did not broadcast. They simply were. A fixed constellation of dormant violence. Traditional power demonstrations involved destruction. A show of force, a barrage into a barren moon, a lightning strike against a target of no consequence. It is a language the Concordium understands, a loud, obvious statement of capability. This was a different language. The human fleet demonstrated power through perfect, unnerving stillness. The ships hung in ominous repose. They did not threaten action. They were the threat. Their presence was the statement. Their quiet was the weapon. Each vessel was a promise, a conditional clause in the ultimatum made manifest in cold metal and shielded reactors. They signaled lethal potential without a single activation sequence. This transformed the entire exchange. It was no longer a negotiation. It was a conditional peace, a temporary state of non-war that existed solely at humanity's discretion. The talking in the grand hall below was just noise. The real conversation was happening in the silence above. The ships were the only argument that mattered now. They were the leverage, the deadline, and the consequence all rolled into one silent looming fact. The longer-term implication became chillingly clear. This was not a one-time display. It was a preview, a demonstration of a core principle. For humanity, restraint was not a weakness. It was both their armor and their threat. The armor was their choice to hold back, to offer a path away from the abyss. The threat was their obvious capacity to stop holding back. The silent fleet was the perfect expression of that duality. It was protection and punishment held in perfect, terrible balance. The anticipation became a tangible force. How long could this standoff last? The human ships gave no sign. They showed no strain. Their energy signatures remained low, stable. They could sit there for hours, days, weeks. They were a monument to patience, a patience that was in itself a form of aggression. The Concordium was trapped in a room with a ticking clock, forced to make a decision under the unblinking gaze of a force that had all the time in the world. The memory of those silent ships would linger long after the immediate crisis passed. They would become a permanent feature in the galactic consciousness, a lesson learned not through explosions and declarations, but through quiet, unwavering presence. Delegates would look up at their own skies for years to come and remember the grid, the silence, the feeling of being measured by something that had not yet decided if it would strike. It was a more potent warning than any victory monument. A victory celebrates an ended conflict. A silent fleet promises one that has not yet begun, and may never need to. The threat of the unmade choice is always greater than the consequence of the one that is. Then the recalibration began. Not on a screen, not in a strategy room, in the minds of every elder delegate sitting in that hall. They had entered with fixed assumptions. A young species meant an impulsive one. A short history meant a shallow one. They measured civilization by the age of your libraries, the complexity of your technology, the length of your unbroken peace. Humanity broke that scale. Humanity's resilience ceases to be a quality. It becomes a force, a relentless embers-grounded force. It is not about bouncing back. It is about enduring. It is the cold, patient certainty of a reaction waiting for its catalyst. The warning is the final courtesy, the last clear signpost before the road changes. The resilience is what waits beyond the signpost. It is the capacity to make the choice presented to the Concordium, not a momentary decision, but a way of existence. They can outlast any conflict. They can endure any cost. The warning is the map. The resilience is the terrain. And the galaxy must now decide if it wants to walk that ground. The final meaning of the warning is its simplicity. There is no hidden clause, no secret exception. It is a direct line drawn in the sand of the cosmos, a line between the masked and the unmasked, between the coffee and the consequence. It reduces a complex galactic struggle to a fundamental truth about human nature. They are what they are. They have shown the control they exert over that nature. The warning is the promise that the control is conditional, on respect, on safety, on the sunrise. The unspoken second half of the statement hangs in the air, more powerful for being omitted. Or we show you what happens when the leash is dropped. The resolution is not in a signed document. It is in the silent acceptance of a new reality. Humanity's position is fixed. Their nature is explained. Their capability is demonstrated. The ball is in the Concordium's court. The warning is the last piece of data they will receive before the equation solves itself. The choice is simple. The outcome is predetermined by the laws of cause and effect. They can have the mask, or they can have the face, but they do not get to complain about the face after they have chosen to see it. The warning was the courtesy, the only one they would get. No formal treaty was signed. No ceremonial documents were exchanged. There was no grand pronouncement of a new era of peace. The resolution happened in silence, In the quiet recalibration of 1,000 alien postures, in the slow dimming of tactical displays as commanders stood down their alerts, a new understanding formed in the Grand Hall. It was not written. It was felt. Traditional diplomacy runs on paper, on sigils and seals and public declarations. It requires ceremony to give weight to words. The Concordium's entire history was a ledger of such agreements. They expected a document, a set of terms to argue over, to amend, to ratify. They were prepared for the long, grinding process of turning a threat into a treaty. They did not get it. The resolution bypassed all of it. It happened through mutual recognition, a shared, unspoken acceptance of a new reality. The human fleet was the document. The stories of the colonies were the clauses. Baba Yaga's words were the signing ceremony. The Concordium's acceptance was not a vote. It was a collective, silent decision to stop fighting, to pull back, to let the 24-hour ultimatum expire without testing its limits. They accepted humanity's terms without a single word of formal ratification. The tension shifted. It was no longer about whether they would agree. The new tension was about time, about durability. How long would this unspoken agreement hold? It was a ceasefire built on a knife's edge of understood consequences, not on shared trust or common cause. It was a peace held together by the memory of a silent fleet and the promise of a face beneath a mask. It was the most fragile kind of peace. And the strongest? There were no guarantees, no mechanisms for arbitration, no committees to oversee compliance. The agreement lived only in the actions that followed, in the Vorlan shock troops powering down their assault vehicles on New Haven, in the scout ships altering course away from human shipping lanes, in the absence of new attack orders. The proof was in what didn't happen. The agreement was enforced not by law but by the constant, quiet presence of the alternative. The leash remained held because everyone now knew precisely what happened if it were dropped. This kind of understanding is fluid. It can change with a shift in leadership, a miscalculation, a moment of pride. It requires constant, silent reassessment, a daily choice by both sides to maintain the status quo. There is no piece of paper to point to, no signed agreement to invoke. There is only the memory of the standoff and the mutual understanding of the cost of breaking it. It is a peace that must be constantly earned, not through words but through restraint. The resolution of the crisis was not an end. It was a beginning, the start of a new unspoken dance between civilizations, a relationship defined not by what was promised, but by what was mutually understood to be true. The human fleet eventually powered down its weapons and retreated from the Council world sky, but it did not disappear. It simply returned to the shadows, a permanent reminder, a silent partner to the agreement. The most powerful agreements are often the ones never put into words. They live in the space between what is said and what is known. They are built on a foundation of demonstrated power and acknowledged consequence. They are flexible. They can adapt to new circumstances without the need for renegotiation. They are also terrifying. Because their terms are unwritten, their boundaries are tested not in courtrooms but in actions. A breach is not a legal violation. It is a return to the silence before the choice. The silence that comes before the mask comes off. This was the new galactic normal, an understanding, a quiet, relentless, and permanent understanding. Humanity's restraint became both armor and threat, a memory the galaxy could neither forget nor dismiss. The mask of civilization remained in place by choice, not necessity. It was a daily decision, a discipline. The silent fleet withdrew, but its shadow lingered. The leash was held, but everyone now knew its strength and its purpose. The choice presented was permanent. The unspoken agreement depended on continued respect for the line that had been drawn. A line between the mask and the face. Choose wisely, because some leashes are not just meant to be held, they are meant to be broken. This was not a debate. It was a warning from the deepest past. A predator recognizes another predator, not by its teeth, not by its size, by its eyes, by the calm, assessing gaze that measures distance and resistance. The elder was saying that what they were witnessing was not humanity's invention. It was a rediscovery, a return to a form of conflict that was older than their Grand Hall, older than their Concordium. It was a voice of caution aimed at its own kind, a rebuke to the younger species who thought their technology made them sophisticated. Rivals who mistake civility for timidity, the elder intoned, may discover a harsher truth once provoked. It was a lesson written in the ashes of dead worlds. A predator's patience is not weakness. It is concentration. The stillness before the pounce is the most dangerous part. Then the elder turned its focus, and the full weight of its attention fell on Baba Yaga. "If you do not seek war," it challenged, its tone not accusatory but probing, "then why this display?" The question was a key turning in a lock. It translated the human's actions into a language the Concordium's ancients understood. This wasn't a plea for peace. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a demonstration of restraint. And a demonstration of restraint is only necessary if you possess something worth restraining. It was a show of force by showing its opposite. The elder was connecting the dots for the room. This careful civility, this offered coffee, this talk of leashes, it was all the prelude. The deep breath before the scream. The mask being adjusted one last time before it was taken off for good. The question hung in the air heavier than any threat. It forced everyone to reconsider everything that had been said. The stories of farmers and mothers were no longer just tales of resilience. They were data points. The chess metaphor was no longer an analogy. It was a confirmed doctrine. The elder's memory provided the context, the sobering counter-narrative to the Concordium's arrogance. This had happened before. Species had risen, wearing the mask of civilization until the mask no longer served them. Then the mask came off. Ancestral memory now lingered in the chamber like smoke. The elder's quiet warning lent a terrifying weight to humanity's menace. It was no longer theoretical. It was historical. It was a cycle repeating. And the eldest being in the room had just identified the new variable. The room held its breath, waiting to see if the cycle would complete, or if it could be broken. Then the ceiling of the grand hall vanished. It didn't shatter. It didn't retract. It simply dissolved into a perfect star-flecked view of the sky above the council world. The shift was so sudden, so absolute, that for a heartbeat the chamber was utterly silent. The delegates looked up, and they saw human ships, dozens, hundreds, silent, dark engines idling, weapons sheathed but unmistakably primed. They hung in a precise grid-like formation directly overhead, a net of coiled force. They hadn't decloaked with a flash of energy or a thunderous roar. They were just there. As if they had always been there, waiting for this exact moment to become visible. The debate was over. Stalemate was a luxury of the past. This was no longer a negotiation. It was a conditional peace. A fact laid bare against the stars. Panic spread through the Concordium chamber like fire racing across dry fields. Alien forms recoiled. Tactical displays flickered to life on armrests. Commanders frantically trying to get a targeting lock, a threat assessment, anything. They found nothing. The fleet's sensor profile was a void. Its numbers were an estimate. Its intention was a cold, hard certainty. Baba Yaga didn't look up. She didn't need to. She watched the delegates instead. Watched their composure crack. Watched the ancient certainty of their power drain from their postures. The thermos was still in her hand. The coffee was still warm. "War," she said. The word was flat, calm. It wasn't a declaration. It was a statement of fact, a potential outcome she was describing, not choosing. It is not our preferred outcome. It is, however, an outcome we are prepared for. Thoroughly. She let them absorb that. Let them look from her calm face to the silent armada above and back again. "You speak of mercy as if it is a virtue," she continued, her voice cutting through the low hum of alarm. "It is not. It is a currency. A form of restraint. We spend it when we believe the cost of not spending it would be higher, when we believe you are worth the investment of our patience." She gestured slightly with the thermos, a small, almost careless motion toward the sky. "This," she said, her tone shifting into something harder, colder, "is what that restraint sounds like. This quiet, this stillness. This is the sound of a choice not yet made, the sound of a leash being held, not dropped." The display was the final undeniable proof. Every story, every metaphor, every philosophical argument she had presented, it was all scaffolding for this moment. The chessboard was real. The poker hand was being shown. The leverage was not theoretical. It was orbital. It was tactical. It was a blade resting against the throat of their entire world, held with a stillness more terrifying than any lunge. Humanity's threat was not a bluff. It was a meticulously orchestrated demonstration of power held in perfect check. They weren't asking to be taken seriously. They were demonstrating that they already were. The mask of diplomacy, of offered coffee and philosophical debate began to slip. Not from clumsiness, from design. They were allowing a glimpse of the face beneath. The face was patience. The face was calculation. And the face was capable of utter, silent, and total violence. The debate was done. The real conversation had just begun. A DRA general rose. His armored plates clicked with each movement, a sound of pure mechanics. He spoke with the flat certainty of a targeting computer. Numbers, he stated. Your species cannot compete with our numbers. In any sustained conflict, our industrial base, our recruitment pools, our fleet reserves, they will crush you. It is a matter of mathematical certainty, not will. He sat down. The argument was clean, simple. It was the kind of logic that won wars in simulations and staff meetings. Overwhelm the enemy with sheer volume. Drown them in metal and bodies. It was the Concordium's oldest and most trusted doctrine. Baba Yaga didn't smile. She didn't frown. She looked at the general as if he'd just explained the rules of a children's game she'd long since mastered. Numbers do not win wars, General, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. Will does. The contradiction hung in the air, stark and simple. He began to rebut, to cite historical precedents of larger armies defeating smaller ones. She cut him off. Not with volume, with precision. History suggests otherwise, she said. The words were a trap door opening beneath his feet. Ask the empires who sent their armies into the mountains of Afghanistan, a place where empires went to die. They had the numbers. They had the technology. They had the mathematical certainty of victory. She let the image form. Ancient, powerful nations brought to a halt not by a grand army, but by the stubborn, relentless will of people who simply refused to stop. Who were willing to fight for generations in the dust and rock, who understood the land and the cost better than any invading force ever could. Your numbers will not crush us, she continued, her gaze locking with the general's. It is hunger, and we are always hungry. The word changed everything. Hunger, it wasn't about food. It was a state of being, a metabolic condition of the human spirit, a deep grinding need to persevere, to endure, to outlast. It reframed the entire concept of warfare. This wasn't a contest of resources. It was a test of moral stamina, a battle of whose spirit broke first. She was reframing their entire perception. Softness was not weakness. It was a discipline, a mask carefully crafted and worn not out of fear but out of choice, a tool to protect others from the unmanaged reality of human potential. You look at our history and see war, she said. We look at it and see the times the leash held, and the times it did not. The mask is a courtesy, a warning in itself. It says, this is how I behave when I am trying. This is the face I show when I wish to coexist. The chilling core of her claim settled over the room. Predators could wear civility. They could mimic peace. They could engage in all the delicate dances of diplomacy and trade and cultural exchange. But it was a performance, a voluntary one. And like any performance, it could end. The anticipation in the chamber was no longer about what humanity would ask for. It was about what would happen if they stopped asking. If the leash, that thin, strong line of willpower and social contract, were to snap. What then? What emerged when the mask came off? The ethical calculus of the encounter shifted entirely. This was no longer a debate about who was right or wrong. It was a statement of cause and effect, a presentation of a fundamental truth about human nature, delivered not as a threat, but as a simple, terrifying fact. They were not pleading for mercy. They were explaining the mechanics of their own restraint. And in doing so, they made it clear that mercy, like civilization itself, was a choice, not a guarantee. The abstract debate ended. Theories of civilization and leashes were elegant. They were also useless to a delegate who saw humanity's words as just that. Words. A rhetorical performance by a species trying to sound more dangerous than it was. A show of philosophical spine to hide military weakness. Baba Yaga understood the dismissal in their postures. The quiet clicks of mandibles. The slow blink of lidless eyes. They wanted data. They wanted proof. So she gave them a different kind of report. She spoke of New Haven, an agricultural colony on the fringe. Its primary export was a type of resilient grain. Its primary defense was a militia of farmers. When the Vorlan shock troops landed, they came in sleek, armor-plated dropships. They carried plasma casters and sonic disruptors. They expected a surrender broadcast within the hour. They got a man named Elias with a pre-spaceflight shotgun, He was 60 years old. His hands were calloused from soil and machinery, not weapons. He stood at the edge of a barley field as the alien patrol fanned out. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He fired that old shotgun until it was empty, took down 3 of them before a plasma burst turned his cover into splinters and ash. He died buying 90 seconds for his neighbors to fall back to the grain silos. A 90-second delay for a man's entire life. The math of it was brutal. The choice was not. She told them about Lyra, a communications technician in the SETI system. Her outpost was overrun. She retreated to a maintenance bay with her 2 children. The only weapon she found was a monomolecular blade used for cutting cable sheathing. It was 10 centimeters long. When the door was breached, she stood in front of her children with that little blade. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just held it. The soldiers hesitated. Not out of mercy. Out of confusion. The disparity was too great. The gesture too absolute. They eventually stunned her. Took them all prisoner. But in that moment of hesitation, she'd won a different kind of victory. She had made their advanced weaponry and numerical superiority irrelevant. She had forced a pause with nothing but the sheer, terrifying weight of a mother's refusal to yield. Then there was Kryn, a mining colony whose orbital defenses were slag. The ground invasion was a foregone conclusion. The Concordium's intelligence predicted total capitulation within a standard day. They were wrong. As the outer fortifications crumbled under artillery, the colonists didn't scream. They didn't pray. They sang an old song, a folk tune about going home. Their voices carried over the comms channels, crackling with static and the sound of collapsing rockreed. They sang as they fell back. They sang as they tended their wounded. They sang until the last stronghold was breached. Then they fought with mining lasers and rock drills. These weren't stories of victory. They were stories of persistence. A farmer's last stand, a mother's blade, a chorus in the rubble. They were small human-scale proofs of a much larger truth. Desperation was one thing. This was something else. This was a stubborn, almost genetic refusal to accept the endpoint. The vignettes landed in the Grand Hall not as pleas for sympathy, but as cold, tactical data. Each one was a counter-argument to the idea that humanity could be broken by sheer force. They complicated the simplistic narrative of a desperate, primitive species. This wasn't desperation. It was identity. The line between mercy and ferocity began to blur. If a woman with a kitchen knife could make trained soldiers hesitate, what did that say about the nature of the threat? If farmers could turn harvest tools into weapons, where did the battlefield truly end? The calculus was shifting. It was no longer about how to defeat humanity. It was about whether that was even possible, or if victory would simply be a new kind of war. The Grand Concordium measured war in fleets, in tonnage of ordnance, in the raw, crushing math of how many ships you could field and how much firepower they could unleash. It was a simple, brutal ledger. They assumed humanity was losing that equation. Baba Yaga let that assumption hang in the air for a moment. Then she asked a question that sounded like it came from nowhere. Have any of you ever played chess? The query was met with a ripple of baffled silence. Chess, a board game, a primitive pastime. It is not about numbers, she continued, her voice level. It is about foresight. A player with fewer pieces can still win. It's not about the strength of the rook. It's about the rook's position. A single piece placed correctly at the exact right moment can unravel an entire empire of pieces. The board is small. The thinking is not. She wasn't talking about a game. She was talking about a mindset. A way of seeing conflict not as a collision of forces, but as a long, patient calculation. Humans didn't just react. They positioned. They sacrificed pawns to open lines of attack they wouldn't use for 100 moves. They thought in layers of consequence the Concordium's simple ledger could never capture. And sometimes, she added, her tone shifting almost imperceptibly, it is not chess. Sometimes it is poker. The new metaphor landed with a different kind of weight. You look at our cards and you think you see a bluff. You see a weak hand, a desperate play. You raise the bet expecting us to fold. She let the silence stretch. Let them feel the table, the chips, the unseen cards. Sometimes we are not bluffing at all. Sometimes the hand is exactly what it appears to be, and you have just bet everything on a misread. The analogy did its work. It reframed the entire galactic tension. The skirmishes on the rim, the diplomatic stalemates, the silent movements of scout ships, they weren't isolated incidents. They were moves on a board, bets placed at a table, a long game humanity had been playing since first contact, and the Concordium had only just realized they were a player in it. The anticipation in the chamber became a sharp, cold thing. What pieces had humanity already placed? What cards were they holding? A rook in the right place. That could be a fleet hidden in a nebula, a listening post disguised as an asteroid, a trade agreement with a neutral species that was actually a mutual defense pact. A single, well-timed piece of information leaked to the right enemy of their enemy. The Concordium's military superiority suddenly felt like a clumsy, obvious weapon. A giant hammer in a fight that was being conducted with scalpels and whispers. They had been looking at the obvious pieces on the board, the colonies, the fleets they could track. They hadn't been looking at the empty squares, the spaces where a move was being prepared. They realized, with a dawning and uncomfortable clarity, that they had fundamentally misjudged human strategic thinking. It wasn't primitive. It was patient. It wasn't about winning the battle in front of them. It was about winning the war 3 moves from now. A game had been underway for years, and they were only now being told the rules. And the first rule was that the most dangerous pieces were often the ones you never saw coming. Then a new voice cut through the chamber. Not loud, not aggressive. It was the sound of stone grinding on stone, of deep time-given sound. It came from the crystalline elder. Its form was a lattice of light and mineral, glowing with a soft internal pulse. It had remained silent through the entire proceeding, an observer, a historian. Until now, most of the Concordium saw humanity as children, loud, impetuous, dangerous in the way a sharp tool is dangerous in untrained hands. They looked at Baba Yaga and saw a clever primate with a thermos and a backbone of steel. They saw a new problem. The elder saw an old pattern. "I have seen such eyes before," the elder said. Its voice didn't echo. It settled. Long ago, when oceans boiled and the skies burned, the words were simple. The images were not. They carried the weight of lived memory, of a galaxy that had known true civilization-ending fire. They called it a peace offering. When humanity's diplomat stepped into the Concordium's grand hall, she carried nothing but a thermos of coffee. But the elder species didn't understand. This wasn't surrender. It was a final warning disguised as civility. What happens when predators choose to wear masks? The grand door slid open without ceremony. Thousands of multifaceted eyes pivoted toward the entrance as humanity's representative walked in alone. No guards, no delegation, no ceremonial robes or traditional gifts. Just one woman carrying a thermos. The Concordium expected deference. They were ancient galactic architects who'd shaped star systems before humans first walked upright. Their chamber was a masterclass in psychological dominance. Vaulted ceilings arching into darkness, alien banners that pulsed with living light, and a throne dais raised so high the representatives had to look down on newcomers. They designed it to overwhelm. To remind young species of their place, she didn't look up. Baba Yaga moved like a blade through water, smooth, silent, purposeful. Her steps made no sound on the iridescent floor. She didn't bow, didn't pause to acknowledge the thrum of disapproval rippling through the assembly. Her expression held a calm, almost detached smile. Not submission, not aggression. Something far more unsettling, balance. The elder species shifted in their seats. Carapaces clicked. Membranes vibrated with low-frequency irritation. They were used to petitioners trembling at the scale of the room, the weight of history, the sheer presence of beings who'd witnessed sons die. They expected humanity to arrive small. They did not expect this. She reached the center of the chamber and stopped, looked around as if she were in a town hall meeting back home, not standing before the galaxy's oldest and most severe arbiters of power. Her posture said neighbor, not subject. Her eyes held the quiet assurance of someone who knows exactly what they're worth. The banners overhead shifted color, glowing brighter in what the universal translators marked as a display of collective impatience. She ignored them. Her gaze swept the assembly, lingering on a few key delegates, skipping over others. She wasn't scanning for approval. She was counting. In that moment, the central conflict of the encounter took shape. Humanity wasn't asking to be heard. They were stating they would be, on their terms, in their way, without apology. A young species by their calendar. An old one by their scars. The air grew thick. The silence became its own kind of sound. She stood perfectly still, thermos in hand, waiting. Not for permission. Not for an invitation. For them to realize the conversation had already begun, and she'd just taken the floor. You could feel the recalibration happening in real time across species lines. Assumptions dissolving, protocols failing. Every elder in that room understood in that moment that nothing about humanity was going to be what they'd predicted. The stage was set. Not for negotiation, for revelation. Then she held up the thermos. The silence in the hall grew textured. A few of the elder delegates leaned forward, their sensory organs twitching. They expected a weapon, or a piece of advanced technology, a demonstration of force to back up her nerve. They got a stainless steel cylinder. A low hum of what the translator flagged as derisive curiosity moved through the chamber. To them it looked primitive. A simple container. Some assumed it was a cultural artifact, a sign of a young species trying to offer something, anything, to prove its worth, a gesture of weakness. They saw a petitioner with a trinket. They were wrong. She unscrewed the cap. The sound was small, sharp in the vast quiet. A rich, bitter aroma spread through the climate-controlled air. Alien olfactory sensors adjusted, some recoiling, others sampling with keen interest. "This is coffee," she said. Her voice didn't rise to fill the space. It just occupied it. "A human ritual. We share it with friends. We share it with enemies. The cup means the same." She didn't wait for permission. She poured a measure into the cap, the dark liquid steaming, held it out toward the dais. Not as a supplicant. As an equal offering a taste. The gesture was simple. But in that room it was a language no one fully spoke. For some species, sharing food was the highest pact, an unbreakable bond of trust. They saw profound vulnerability in her offering a consumable substance. A gamble on their honor. Others saw cold calculation, a test, a way to force a reaction, to see who would accept and who would refuse, to map the room's alliances through a single sip. They watched her hands, her eyes, looking for the trick. There was no trick, just the offer. A delegate from the crystalline hegemony extended a slender appendage, took the cap, and brought it to a sensory node. It paused, then gave a slow, measured dip, a sign of respect. Another species, insectoid and wary, emitted a soft click of refusal. The cultural gulf was now a tangible thing in the room, smelled and tasted and silently judged. The coffee became more than a drink. It was a shared experience, a common ground built on a foreign ritual. For a moment, the tension softened. The mood shifted from confrontation to curiosity. She had used their own expectations against them. They expected threat displays. She gave them civility. But every move was layered. The casual pour, the steady hand, the calm explanation, it all carried a second meaning. This was not a surrender. It was a demonstration. See how civilized we can be. See the rituals we've built. See the peace we can offer. It was a show of restraint. And restraint, when displayed so deliberately, is itself a form of power. It says, we are choosing this. We are capable of the opposite. The peace offering was never about peace. It was about positioning. She wasn't proving humanity was harmless. She was proving they were in control. Of themselves. Of the moment. The thermos wasn't a symbol of weakness. It was the leash held loosely. And everyone was starting to wonder what happened if she decided to drop it. Then the accusation started. A scaled delegate from the Vorland sovereignty rose, its voice a series of modulated clicks that the translator rendered as cold condemnation. It called humanity aggressive, uncivilized, a young species still mired in primal violence, unfit for the orderly conduct of interstellar relations. It was a familiar argument, an old one, the kind of dismissal the Concordium had used for centuries to keep younger races in their place. Baba Yaga listened. She didn't interrupt. She let the words hang in the air. Let the other delegates nod their agreement or remain silent in complicit assent. They expected denial, justification, perhaps a plea for understanding. They didn't get it. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, calm. It cut through the residual echo of the Vorland's speech like a blade through mist. "You misunderstand the nature of our civilization," she said. "You see it as an achievement, a sign of progress away from something base. It is not." She paused, letting the contradiction settle. A few delegates shifted, their forms rustling with confusion or irritation. "Civilization was not born from peace," she continued. "It was not a gentle evolution. It was a leash, The word landed in the silent chamber with the weight of a physical object. Leash. It implied something wild, something that needed to be held back, controlled. We did not build cities and laws and codes of conduct because we are peaceful by nature, she explained, her gaze sweeping the assembly. We built them because we are not. They are not a symptom of our goodness. They are the dam holding back the flood. Every manner, every ritual, every treaty and handshake and shared cup of coffee, it is a restraint, a conscious daily effort to prevent what we are from destroying what we have built and what you have built.